Hello there, I'm Leo Waldock, this is Kit Guru, and this is the Lian Li PCO5S. Let's play geek word association. If I think Lian Li, the words that come to mind are aluminium, stylish and expensive. I'd also throw into the equation minimalist. Essentially we're talking aluminium boxes, they have some drive bays and fan housings and a few neat touches very often where you can remove one component and put an alternate drive bay, so you can add some input-output ports or something like that. Going back many years, Lian Li was one of the first companies to give you the option of removing drive towers from inside their cases to open up a whole load of space. That's my overriding impression of Lian Li. Aluminium, minimalist, expensive. I don't think of them as designer products, I think of them more as engineered products. And that makes the PCO5S a bit of an oddball because it is something new in the world of Lian Li as far as I'm concerned. And it's definitely an interesting PC case rather. The thing with it also is, it begs the question, how do you orient the chassis? Let's take a closer look at it. Looking at the front of the case, you'll see that the USB 3 ports and the headset jacks and the slimline optical drive are quite clearly in the wrong orientation. So this stand, although it looks very pretty, it's self-evident this is sort of not really how it's meant to be. The case should quite clearly be laid down. So let's sort that out. So there we go. With the PCO5S laid down, it's crystal clear this is the correct orientation. It's a kind of amplifier receiver type of thing that goes in your hi-fi setup, or perhaps it goes under your TV if you have a particularly large TV as a sort of a glorious media center kind of computer sort of setup. Or is it? The funny thing is that Lian Li actually calls this a wall-mounted case. Lifts it up carefully, that hole there and that hole there. The idea is you put it on your wall, which immediately makes me think of one of those Bang & Olufsen BO centres from, oh, when would that be, the 80s I suppose, when we moved from LPs to CDs, and some bright spark at Bang & Olufsen thought, I know, we can hang that on its side on the wall. Well, you could sort of see the reasoning. CDs were brand new, they were funky, they were cool, they were happening. I struggle to think of a single reason why I'd want to hang a PC on the wall, even if it does look this glorious. And that actually takes us to the heart of the PCO5S. It's worth pointing out, by the way, this is the mini ITX version of the PCO5S. There's also a PCO6S, which is micro ATX, and a PCO7S, which is ATX. Now, when we get into this, you'll see that this top section, and we're going to have to discuss orientation, because if that's the front, this is the back. So is that the top? It's only the top of it stood upright at the moment. This is the side. But anyway, this compartment here holds two case fans. They're 120mm fans. And Lian Li says you can substitute that for a 240mm radiator if you like. Frankly, you can't, but we'll come to that in time as well. The other two versions, the 06 and the 07, can both support a 360mm radiator, so logically they are three 120mm fans long. Now, as it happens, here we actually have two 120s plus a bit of space. So I don't know the dimensions of the slightly larger cases. I guess they're a bit bigger. But anyway, putting that to one side, prices. PCO5S is £214 in VAT. The PCO6, the micro ATX, 254, and the PCO7S, 278. Lian Li also complicates things slightly by saying that they are PCO5SX, PCO6SX, and PCO7SX. The X being black inside as well as outside. There is apparently or possibly going to be a PCO5, which I guess would not be black inside. Whether it's black outside remains to be seen. Perhaps it's just pure aluminium, you know, the silvery colour. That's supposed to be £190, but whether it actually happens or not remains to be seen. So at the moment, this is a PCO5SX. However, you can ignore the X because at the moment it's the only version there is on the market. All a bit complicated. Anyway, so it shouldn't stand on its end. It looks right on its bottom, as it were, and wall mounting a bit peculiar. Anyway, let's have the top off it, which is these great big thumb screws. and I'll show you a few of the secrets inside the case. I'm also going to point something out. When I did the Inwind D-frame Mini quite recently, I referred on that was all aluminium, but aluminium tubing and welded together, and I made a reference to the tempered glass cover. And here's the irony, the very next case we have up, tempered glass. 2 in 1 year, what can you say? Anyway, let's have a close look at the features inside this PCO5S. The layout inside the PCO5S is unusual to say the least. Here we have the Mini ITX motherboard, there we have the graphics card, and here we have the SFX power supply. Doesn't look right, does it? And the explanation for this curious mounting of the graphics card is that there's a sort of a ribbon cable that goes through that slot there, loops around and pops up here. So you connect the ribbon cable into your PCI Express slot here, and it feeds up there, graphics card goes in horizontally. So that's why you can see the 3 major components all laid flat. Where are the drives? Here's the answer. There's a drive bay that sits in this compartment here, this section here. In fact, it goes that way round, and then these 2 thumb screws from the other side. You also have the option of putting an SSD on the back of the case, and that's what I've done, sort of behind the motherboard tray. Now the thing is, if you leave this drive bay in place, you're limited on the space for the graphics card. You're limited to a Mini ITX card. This Sapphire R9285 is absolutely ideal for the job, Mini ITX model. However, if you remove the drive bay, you'd think you can install a longer graphics card, and indeed you can fit a 12.5-inch model, so a full gaming card. The problem there is, of course, you have to power the thing. And the thing is that most SFX power supplies aren't particularly beefy models. This Be Quiet SFX2 is actually a 300 watt model, and if you look very closely, have eagle eyes, you'll notice I've made a mistake when I requested this power supply from them, because the 300 watt model has a single graphics connector and it has a 4-pin ATX12V connector. I should have asked them for the 400 watt model, which has an 8-pin EPS connector and dual graphics connectors. Silly me. So this setup I've actually got here doesn't actually work. For testing, I had to cobble in a power supply and run the cables into the case because it was a regular ATX case, a ATX power supply, and therefore it doesn't fit in the case. So if you have a longer graphics card, you'll definitely need to remove the drive caddy, drive bays, but with this Mini ITX card, that power connector on the end actually wouldn't have quite gone into place if I'd left the drive bays in place. So really, you're pretty much obliged to remove them. Now, I struggle to see, with a case of this type, who's going to want 3 hard drives as storage. It seems a bit oldie-worldy to me. The idea of having 1 or 2 SSD bays on mounts on the back of the motherboard tray makes perfect sense, but those drive bays in that space there don't quite get it. Now, the SFX power supply with the ASRock M8 that we saw quite a few weeks ago now, that came, as I recall, with a 600 watt power supply in it. So there are SFX power supplies on the market that can supply a full gaming system, but you'll need to look around. Anyway, Be Quiet, they have a 400 watt version of this 300 watt. I should have got that, my fault. Now then, if we turn around, so you can see where the power supply connects. This is another oddball feature of this case. The 4 screws that mount the power supply on this bracket here, they're obviously inside the case. Every power supply I've mounted in my life, I think, in a case, it screws to the outside. You have to sometimes slide the power supply through the case or slip it in through the side or some such, but the screws are on the outside of the case. Here they're inside. And this is really peculiar because it means that the mains socket, as it is, no, mains plug, isn't it? That's right, it's the female that's on the cable. So, socket, plug. It means that you have to feed your mains cable through the PC and out here. And to do that, through this sort of little opening here, you actually have to remove this panel, which is held in place with 3 screws. And that very much gets to the heart of the PCO5S and its design. It's a series of parts. You can see screws here. There's a basic sort of central core to the case, and then there's all these bits that are screwed on, and it can get quite frustrating. So to get the power supply in and out, and obviously you generally only fit a power supply and you build the system, you have to get these 4 screws in place. Well, to get to those, you can see there's no access whatsoever. You have to remove this top fan cover. Now that's only 2 screws here, 2 screws on the other side. It's not massively difficult. In fact, I'll do it now. Move the turntable, stand the case up, grab my screwdriver, take out the 4 screws. And then I'll lay it back down and you'll see what's what. There are incidentally photos on the Kit Guru website of the case dismantled because it's such an unusual piece of hardware. Now if I lay that back down and slide this, well they call it top, but the way it is really the same. You see, and you can see the fan wires. And now you've got access to the top of the power supply. Except you don't, because these 2 screws are behind this pillar. And they're really quite a close fit, unless you take off this side panel here, which is actually the front panel, and you don't particularly want to be touching that if you can avoid it. This panel's quite easy to remove. So access to the power supply mounts, tricky. It's a similar story with the graphics card. They use what they call thumb screws, and if I just take one of those out, because it's there are 4 expansion slots available. You can put the graphics card in one position, or you can move it up should you wish. I can't see any reason why you want to do that. They call these thumb screws. They're not really particularly useful with your or easy to operate with your thumbs because they're knurled. They've got a crosshead in them, so you can use a screwdriver, as I just did. Now the thing is that access to these screws, particularly the lower ones, the motherboard's in the way. Obviously it's in the way. So when you're building your system, you have to put the graphics card in place first, and then you can secure it. Then you put the motherboard in. Well, when you put the motherboard in, you suddenly find, hang on a minute, there's almost no clearance for cooling. There is less than 90mm clearance above the processor and below that glass cover. So I was obliged to use this Noctua NHL12 low profile cooler. Now generally you use this heatsink with a 120mm fan on the top. There is no space, so I've used it with the I think it's a 95mm. There's a sort of a secondary fan that sits under here, so it's only yay size. I much prefer to use the top fan. It's bigger and it's nice and quiet. I had to use that fan, and that means that the ability of this heatsink to keep your processor under control is sorely limited. So I've actually used our Pentium Anniversary processor in this rather than the Core i7, which is what I wanted to use, because there's just no space for the heatsink to go. That Noctua squeaks in and does a fine job, but it's not really ideal. Now we are apparently able to substitute the 2 case fans for a liquid cooler, a 240mm radiator. The radiator would absolutely go in there. You could put the fans in, well, I say no problem at all. They'd go in there. However, mounting the heatsink mechanism and pump on the processor, you've got to feed the hoses away. They simply aren't going to flex and go up there. It's just not going to happen. I tried it. It just wasn't on. So you can mount a radiator. Lian Li actually refers to it in their manual, I say manual 2-page setup sheet, as a water loop. But I'd struggle to see it. Now, I'm prepared to accept that you could build a custom liquid cooling system that would mount here and feed up to here, and it would all work. Particularly if you used pipes rather than water hoses, but you're basically stuck with the case fans there and a low profile cooler, and that's a strange old setup. Now I'm sure you want to see what's around the back of this extraordinary case. I say back, or is it the bottom? I mean, frankly, I'm losing track. If we remove these 4 thumb screws, 1, 2 from this flat aluminium panel, which you'll notice has some ventilation sort of towards one corner, and the ventilation lines up with the bottom of the motherboard. Right, and lift that away. Now, it's a flat plate, it's got this sort of mesh filter in place. You can remove that, and if you choose, you can then install a fan to sit below the motherboard. Now, what we have is the SSD mount. There's another one there. That bracket is secured with 4 screws, so you undo the 4 screws, take out the piece of aluminium, mount the SSDs to it, put it back in place. Works very well. It kind of sums up the whole Lian Li ethos though, which is aluminium, lots of it. So let's have another of those. One of those Fantex sort of grip and lock type bays where you simply push the drive into place. It's so much easier. But in this instance, 4 screws away it comes, attach the SSD with more screws, put it back. It's all a bit laborious. And after all the fun and games with the CPU, CUDA and the power supply, frankly, by this stage, all the undoing and doing of things, you really want to see less of it. Anyway, so there's the back of the motherboard tray, motherboard rather. Great big cutout, that's all good. You can see there the ribbon cable that feeds to the graphics card, which goes behind the SSD mount, and then some cabling from the power supply. So it's all fairly neat and tidy. Just take those thumb screws out of the way. Now there is something slightly odd. So these thumb screws retain this panel in place, and that's fine. In the bag of bits that you get with this case, you also receive these 4 feet. So if you're putting the case down flat, mounting it on feet, good idea. They have this rubber washer on the one side, and that side is sort of shiny. Logically, it goes like so, with the rubber against the tabletop. And Lian Li refers to substituting the thumb screws for these feet. Except I couldn't find any fasteners that would obviously go through the centre of the feet to attach them, and they've got these little plastic dimples on the top, which means that they don't actually sit flat against the bottom. It's a single hole. It's not like there's a sort of a location hole next to it which the pin would sit in. So these feet, whilst they look like they do the job, as far as I'm concerned, they're just wrong. Someone somewhere's just messed up. It's a small mistake, but when you consider this case is £214, and that's a direct conversion from the American and Euro pricing, because I actually came up with the same figure myself independently before they announced the UK price. But no matter how you look at it, that's a lot of money. For that money, I want the thing to be perfect and wonderful and glorious, and messing around with chromed plastic feet that don't have screws and that don't have that have these little plastic dimples that you probably have to lop off with a pair of side cutters. That's just daft. If we go to the I/O panel, which sort of sits in this weird shrouded kind of area, I'm not quite clear why they've gone for this thing. I mean, every other case, you know, the I/O panel is easy to get to. You've also got what look like access points for an external cooling system. I can't begin to imagine who's going to use any such system on this sort of case, particularly if you had, I mean, can you imagine having a wall-mounted case and then feeding water hoses through there? It's like, what? So that's all a bit peculiar, but you can see also how the power supply cable has to route in before it goes off to your main socket. So curiouser and curiouser. Anyway, let's put it back down as nature intended. And let's see where we stand with the PCO5S. Now the thing is, there's some lovely engineering in this case, no two ways about it. The aluminium work is exemplary, the finish is glorious, all the different bits and pieces. If I'd made this myself at home in a shed, I'd be jumping around, clapping my hands and patting myself on the back. It's lovely. However, as a finished product from a company with a long established history like Lian Li, it leaves me completely confused. I don't see it, even though it's a relatively small mini ITX. It's relatively small because it's mini ITX. It's not small. You can see that it's almost the same size as a regular PC tower. I can't see it under my TV. In the event I could build it as a gaming PC and it would be a kind of Steam machine sort of thing, I could maybe see that. But why wouldn't I just build a regular PC? I mean, there are plenty of other ways of doing it. This curious layout, I don't know. And I would absolutely, if I'm using a proper processor, want a proper cooler, and there just isn't the clearance for the cooler to work. I was slightly cruel to ASRock with its M8 because they're much more compact chassis than this, and they had two 80mm fans at the top and two 80mm fans at the bottom, and they were limited on space for the processor. Exactly the same, except the chassis is considerably smaller than this. This is, by that standard, a large chassis. So everything I said about ASRock, and I may have been slightly harsh, it applies doubly to this chassis. Mind you, the ASRock is also quite expensive. I think I figured out that chassis was 250 to possibly 300 pounds. So it's the same sort of money. But anyway, processor cooling, it's a problem. If you want a gaming PC, this isn't the way to do it. If you want like a home media center kind of PC, this could do it. I'm not quite sure why you'd do it in this way, however. It makes far more sense to me to go down the highly integrated AMD FM2 route, the Kaveri. Much smaller system, use the integrated graphics. It's got a universal video decoder built into the APU. You don't need a graphics card. You don't need a case as big as this. So this for me makes no sense as a media center. It makes no sense for me as a gaming PC, and the idea of mounting it on my wall, no matter what it is, apart from as a very lovely thing to look at, I don't understand that either. So I suppose I'm really confused, and I think the heart of it is, as I said at the start of this video, to me Lian Li, it's an engineering company. It makes engineered products, and this strikes me as suffering more from a case of style over content. I think it's been styled rather than designed. As a for instance, and you'll probably notice this, filtration, it's non-existent. You've got fans inside the case, there's air moving around, you've got fans at the top. Now, that perforated aluminium, it will catch dust, you'll probably be able to peel it off, but there's no filtration. The dust is going to get in unless you have the thing up high and it's an immaculately clean house you live in which case obviously that's fine. But it's just like, what's going on? So I like the metalwork. The thinking behind this case, it confuses me. The details of it drive me potty. Access to the power supply mounts, the way you put the motherboard in with the cooler on it, but there's not enough clearance for a decent cooler. Putting the graphics card in place before you put the motherboard in. Why they bothered with those drive bays in the corner, which are basically unusable, I don't understand. The fact that I got in the wrong model of power supply, that's my own damn fault. Anyway, with the Pentium anniversary, let me go to my figures. Here we go. With the Pentium anniversary, so it's only a dual-core processor and doesn't therefore put much of a load on the cooling. And with this R9285 Mini ITX graphics card, the temperatures, the CPU idled at 38, which is actually a bit higher than I would have liked, and the GPU idled at 36, which is also a tad higher than I would have liked. However, temperatures under load were trivial. The CPU is 60, the GPU 71. But realistically, the load on them it's not a lot. It's a dual-core processor, so this cooler does very well indeed on that. If it's a quad-core, and the graphics card had plenty of room to work, and Sapphire's done a fine job cooling that Mini ITX model. So this hardware, in this case, albeit I had to cobble in the power supply because I mucked up with the Be Quiet, it works, but I don't know what it achieves. I'm not going to play games on it, and I'm not going to build a PC like this just to surf the web and shop at Amazon. So this is me ending the year really rather confused. Anyway, this is Leo Waldrop for Kit Guru, and this is the Lian Li PCO5S.